Greetings. This will be another fairly short one because it's sort of one sort of thought logic that I want you to sort of mull over. You don't have to agree with it, but do think about it. So before you actually listen to the rest of this short sort of essay or video blog, please watch that Suzuki video that I sent you guys, I believe yesterday, maybe the day before. So just if you want to pause or come back to this, go and see that and then come back to this. Okay, so I'm assuming you're coming back to this. When you're looking at North America, I'll explain this, like the detention, you're gonna not include the area from here south. And you're looking at the sort of the contemporary 21st century issue of environmental responsibility. This goes into things like we're seeing earlier with the things like coffee in Guatemala and stuff like that, is the idea of fair price, fair trade. All these different types of issues, many of which are started in the United States and many of which sort of have discussion, but also involve an enormous amount of, especially the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years, sort of a pushback with the, well, you know, the rest of the world is got to be responsible for their part of the mess, etc. And that's certainly to a certain extent is true. But you have to remember, if we look at sort of the global situation, again, with time, because remember, we all live in history. You have to remember that North America really is not is really sort of the equivalent of someone in a glass house throwing rocks. And there's a very simple reason for that. If you look at the rest of the planet, with the exception of the African region largely, what you see is an area that, one, has been inhabited for an incredibly long period of time. I guess Australia would also be minus that. And what that means is the human population has been the dominant, you know, predator or species, whatever you want to call it, and basically most of the rest of the planet for tens, and in some cases, especially if you're looking at Eurasia and such like that, hundreds of thousands of years. And in that, they've made enormous amounts of change. My area, especially, that I work on, spend a lot of time on now outside of Hawaii, is China. And you find, we might have, don't even remember if I went over it, but for example, in China, you find that you have cities 10,000 years ago. By 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, you have cities the size of what later becomes Imperial Rome. By the time Rome starts up and you have the Roman Empire, Imperial Rome itself could be swallowed up in the city of Chang'an. So what you have is this enormous number of people going back thousands of years in China, and enormous amounts of environmental change, social change, etc. And that's true of all the rest of the world, with the exception of 3 locations, again, Africa, Australia, and North America. Now, folks move into the Americas early on, relatively speaking, much later than the rest of the world, but thousands of years ago, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, people move into the Americas and settle it. That's much earlier than Australia, which was about maybe 10, 15,000 years ago. And of course, much later than the African region, because the African region is most likely where the human population starts as a species. Having said that, the African region, as we saw when we were looking at it, is not really conducive to large mass populations. The environmental conditions aren't attractive or you know, don't help that. You know, the issues that the human species have with other related species, and also with things like, as we see with the COVID-19, with other species that predate to a certain extent. When you think of a virus predating on prey, you know, it just, the African continent just never has really been a game player. There's been parts of times where places like Egypt have been, but it's never been a player. Australia, actually, in some ways, we'll see, has the same issue as here. You have a population, they're very, very small. Environmental conditions do not make a large population attractive or even particularly viable. So you have people in this area, you know, maybe almost contemporaneously with the Americas, but they're not large amounts of people. Now, they have environmental impacts. In the Americas, some of the larger herd animals get pretty heavily impacted by human migration into the Americas. But very quickly, the vast majority of the rest of them adapt, and the human species just becomes part of the package of species that exist in the, you know, the ecosystems of this region. By about 5, 6, 7,000 years, from roughly this area here, down through the Mexican, the Central American region, and down to basically, you know, what would now be northern Chile in this area region here, you end up with massive social change and very, very large, very, very complex populations. The Moche, for example, and then later the Inca, for example, in this particular region. The Azteca here, the Mayan here. Very, very large, very complex, very urbanized, very centralized populations, and massive amounts of environmental change because they're heavily involved in intensive farming, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, if you want to, from here on south, this ends up looking a lot like what you see in the Eurasian region. Large settled populations, large political systems, large bureaucracies, I mean, the whole 9 yards. Having said that, from here on north, you don't get that. What you get in this region here is very, very small populations. They never become even what you might call sort of the dominant species. In much of the central part of the United States and Canada, what you have is enormous herd populations of large herbivores. And the human population pretty much moves around the fringes of that. Along the rivers, what you have are settled populations, but again, fairly small. There's been a bunch of recent work done on pollen studies, basically in environmental patterns. And there's absolutely no evidence from the environmental record that the human populations made major changes in the actual ecosystems in this part of the world. That's also very true in Australia. There's very little evidence in Australia that the Aboriginal population, or your human population in Australia, made major environmental changes in the entire continent. So in both these areas, what you had is things weren't the same. You had a new species, i.e. people, and here they were part of the mix of what was going on. But it certainly was not like what you see in the rest of the planet or even the same part of the planet south of here. Now, all this radically changes, and ironically, almost exactly the same time. The Brits, i.e. the Europeans, settle in Australia, late 1700s, early 1800s. The Europeans, even largely the British and the French, settle in the North American region, a little bit early 1600s, but the population starts to rapidly expand off the eastern seaboard in the 1700s. So when you're looking at human impacts and enormous amounts of change in both these regions, it's the 19th century. It's only 200 years ago, folks. And if you look at this, the United States has the list of probably the worst environmental record of any place on the planet. I'm not talking about the more recent pollution issues, but I'm talking about the fact that in less than 100 years, you managed to wipe out the bison, the buffalo, which was one of the largest herd animals on the planet. The northern bison herd in this region, for example, was estimated having 17 million animals. By 1872, it's extinct. Southern population was was probably larger. By 1881, it's extinct. By the early 20th century, in other words, within 100 years of populations here, basically Anglo-Americans, starting to predate on these animals, you've basically erased millions and millions, not only of that species, but the antelope and everything else that was on these huge, complex, dynamic movements of species, to the extent that in the United States, by the early 20th century, the buffalo becomes extinct. You see it on coins, but you can't find a live one. In the late 20th century, largely from the 1960s, but especially 70s and 80s on, and in large part initiated by Native Americans and reservations, you actually have them bring buffalo back in from remaining small herds in Canada to resettle in North America, which is a stunning concept when you think about it. You managed to basically wipe out an entire large part of a biome in less than 100 years, purely for the purpose of not even particularly consumption. A lot of the buffalo were killed for their tongues. You let the other 95% of it rot. In a later period, you go back and pick up the bones because you want to grind them into fertilizer. So you're not hunting these animals because they're dangerous. You're not hunting these animals because they're predating on you. You're not even hunting these animals because you're going to use all of them. You're hunting these animals because you can. And killing them, just for the purpose of killing them, becomes a central part of the American ethos. In that same period, you get rid of one of the largest bird populations in the world, and the passenger pigeon, which becomes extinct by, I believe, 1905, 1910. There's still stuffed passenger pigeons in the Smithsonian collection. But that entire species of pigeon vanishes from the planet. And again, are they hunted? Yes. People just shoot the crap out of them. Do they eat them? No. They just shoot them because you can. And they decide, oh, they're a pest and they doo-doo on cars, whatever it is. They just decide they don't want them around anymore. So they just wipe them off the planet. Now, in the rest of the planet, the human species wiped out stuff, but it took thousands of years. Only in the United States do we have a history of completely majorly changing enormous parts of our environment in an incredibly small period of time, and very much like a childhood. No forethought, no thought attached to it, no consequences attached to it, just because I want to. And to a certain extent, when I was talking about last time about the issue of the Colorado River, Americans decide they have to have lawns. Americans decide they have to have pools. Americans decide they have to wash their cars all the time. And the fact that you're actually massively changing a whole ecosystem and destroying the lives of tens of thousands of people down here, just so you can have those things, doesn't interest people. It's been brought up since the 1940s and 1950s by folks. You know, if you keep this path, you're going to do these type of changes. People go like, so. So the United States has one of the worst records, just from sort of general attitudinal, collectively, not individually, but collectively, in terms of in dealing with environmental issues. To put it in a very blunt way, Americans are stunningly selfish when it comes to the planet. As long as we get what we want, maybe we'll feel a little consequence. So you get the weird situation, you genocide all these species, you wipe out all these species in this huge central part of the United States. At the same time, you have the growth of things like the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So people are willing to put money into saving dogs, but they have no compunction about killing millions of animals. You know, it's weird. It's just flat out strange. And in the 21st century, it makes absolutely no sense. Because of course, the United States is not an island, it's part of a continent. Canada has somewhat of a better record, but when it comes to, for example, logging, Canada's as bad or not worse than the United States. So they don't exactly have a right to point a lot of fingers. This whole part of the world has been completely logged out. When I was finishing high school, we moved up to Oregon, and we're living here. I bet you I can show you this. One of the things I didn't really understand, I'd heard the term, but I didn't really understand what the term meant. You get all these spotchy pieces here. And you see this all throughout the Pacific Northwest. These are areas that were logged. So what you did, and this is still common practice today, you go through and you cut all the trees out here. Now, actually, all of this area has been logged. So what you used to do is you just go and you cut every tree down. And then you just leave and you go cut another piece down. This is what Suzuki's talking about in this little video. Now, what they decided to do is in the 1950s, 60s, because you had basically logged out everything. There's less than 2% of the original forest that was around in 1800 that is still in this entire area, from down here all the way up through here. 3 states and Western Canada. It's almost entirely logged out in what we call, original forest. And that's why it's got these little blotchy pieces no matter where you go. Here, we're in Washington, it's the same thing. So then they decided they were going to, quote, manage the forest by the 50s and 60s. So what you do is you go in and after you're done cutting these out, because remember you only want 1 or 2 species, you're only going to be cutting fir trees, and what you guys think of as Christmas trees, fir trees or pine. And then when you're done, what you do is you just walk away from it. Well, in this particular reason, because of the environmental conditions, I'm just segue here, I have no idea where we are. What you've got here is a fair amount of heavy rainfall. So when you've cut all these trees down, the rain comes screeching down in the winter, in the spring, and whatever's ice melts off, and all the topsoil that made this a useful environment is gone. Now, the only place you're going to see trees is out here along the rivers and the streams. And some of that might be original trees because it was too expensive for the logging companies to go in and get just a few trees. See, basically, it's like sandblasting. You just take everything off of this, and then you walk away from it. Now, most of this property is actually owned by the federal government. So you as taxpayers, actually, this is your land. This is federal land. The farming, or I should say the lumber companies go in, they pay a small sum of money, and they go and they take off the timber. Now, they were supposed to return it to its original form. Till the 1970s, they just pretended this was the original form. Oh, trees will grow back. But of course, what happens is since you strip this out, is because you strip so much of it out, is the entire ecosystem is gone. So at most what happens is you get a little scraggly stuff growing back, what we call secondary growth, and this is absolutely horrible stuff. And you're never going to get the mix of all the environment. Now, what you've also lost when you cut all this out is you lose all the animals and the other species of even smaller things like weeds or whatever that were dependent in part of that whole ecosystem in which those taller trees were a part of. Everything is erased. It's just like erasing a blank slate or erasing part of your drive. You've erased that. So what they started doing in the 60s and 70s, and they still do this a lot today, is you go in and because you want to make it look like you're doing something, is you go in and you take a bunch of little pine trees, little tiny ones like you'd buy in, say, the store at Christmas time, little tiny, 1 or 2 foot tall ones in little buckets, and you pay people to go stick them in the ground. Now, this is a managed before section. And if you notice here, what you've got is one species of tree, and that's all you've got there. Now, if you look at that compared to this, notice how you've got a real mix of things. You've got what looks like birch here, all sorts of complex things. In fact, if you notice, this has been logged recently. So what you did is you stripped everything you could make money off of. You just left the rest of it dead. And then you walk away from it. In fact, you can see that it's rained very heavily here. A lot of this has been eroded down. So you've lost the topsoil. In other words, this place can't grow stuff anymore. It's now pretty much sterile. It's like a house, and when you tear a house down in Kaimoki, it's the empty lot underneath it. That ground is sterile. Same thing here. So if you notice, you got a fairly complicated mix of stuff here, and here you got nothing. Here you've replaced that complex mix. Here's a little baby piece of the complex mix. You replaced it with one species of tree. And these places look like plantations because that's what they are. And then what you're going to do is in 30 or 40 years, when this is growing back, is you're going to go and you're going to whack it again and do the same thing again and again and again. Of course, every time you do it, there's less that will grow back. Here's an area that's just been planted, I suspect. So what you do is you go and you basically do this. Now, this is your land. This is federal land. This belongs to the people of the United States. A few companies make an enormous amount of money off of this. Most of the lumber is sold in the United States, it's sold in Asia, sold in Europe, sold anyplace else in the world. So they do incredibly well. Warehouser, was it Boise Cascade, the two I remember. So what you get is these enormous environmental impacts. All these areas, all this, the dirt and all the stuff, the pollution, all the runoff you get from these areas that are destroyed runs into these rivers, and it goes down through here, goes down here until eventually gets in the ocean. And here with this huge amount of silt, you can see the end result of that. Now, as all rivers in this area had, this used to have huge runs of fish that came up here, among other things, salmon, steelhead and stuff, smelt. They would come up these rivers all the way for miles and miles and miles upstream and use those rivers to spawn and reproduce. And there were all sorts of other species, elk, et cetera, that lived in this area, deer and such, that use these mixed biotic systems to reproduce and basically live the life cycles out. The minute you destroy this area, you erase that entire sequence. It's gone. And you've done it to make a little bit of profit that's going to last you for maybe a couple of months. You log off an area like this, an area this would take about 2-3 weeks for a logging company to do it. And they go and send in a couple of guys, minimal level education. They go and plant a few trees in here, pitiful little trees. Now, of course, these trees are going to grow very, very slowly because as you can see, they just literally planted them in the debris from the time before, which is very different than, for example, if this had actually been burned off. If this had been a fire, on one hand, it would have looked more destructive, but all the tree remnants would be in place, the roots would be in place, and what you're going to find is that forest would pop back fairly quickly. This forest ain't coming back for a really, really, really long time. And this is what we call clear cutting, which is the way that you do forestry in the Pacific Northwest. And it's very typical of the American way of dealing with the environment. The environment is seen as a financial resource, and you take advantage of it, you maximize your profit out of it, and then you just walk from it. In fact, it's not ironic. Look at that. What do we got here? A warehouser plant, whose job is to process all that lumber we saw from all those places upstream. And then the pollution goes down here and has made a huge mess and made this river basically uninhabitable to the various species of plants and animals that used to inhabit it. You still got a salmon place here, but in many cases what you find is these salmon runs are now artificial because now you actually have fake lakes, fake rivers made of concrete where you actually breed the salmon, and then you go and you put them back in the stream so that you can basically replace the very same ecosystem that you wiped out, which is incredibly expensive. Or if you guys buy salmon now, what you actually do is you have huge cages off here in the ocean, and you raise the salmon just usually like you'd raise chickens in a cage, which is one reason why if you have live caught salmon or wild salmon, it tastes radically different than what you guys would buy in the store most of the time. So this is the American attitude towards the environment. How can you maximize your profit? How can you minimize your cost? And of course, if you're one of the lumber companies like Weyerhaeuser, this is fantastic. You didn't have to buy this property. You just paid the federal government to basically mine it. You mine it of trees. When you're done, you have no consequences. You may be, oh, okay, we'll plant a few trees, and then you walk from it. Then you go find another spot, you do the same thing over again. This is, in this region, it's trees. In other regions, like Nevada, it'll be mining. In other regions, like say Utah, Arizona, it might be water. But the way we treat all the environment is exactly the same irregardless of where you are. It's always based on this really incredibly dysfunctional impact on the environment. And the thing that makes it different than what you would see in some place like China, which is just brutally terrible in terms of its environmental conditions, is the Chinese have been at it for a really long time, and the environment's changed a lot in a long time. Yeah, they've made a huge mess of it now, but that environment was different. So you can argue to some extent, at least I would argue, that their level of responsibility is a little bit less because they didn't understand until basically the 1950s, 60s what they were getting into. We have no excuse in the North American region. This place existed in a way. People come from other parts of the planet to see it that way. We even go to places like Yellowstone to experience what was the norm in this entire region. And we've done it in a period when we were educated and when we understood the consequences. We just didn't give a crap. I think that's the telling thing about North America. So we really do have, I would argue, a level of responsibility when it comes to environmental behavior that, one, we do not exhibit at all, and two, does not give us the right to complain about anyone else's behavior until we clean up our own house. And the fact that even in 2020, it's the United States that refuses to sign the climate accords. It's the United States that has one of the largest populations of people that are adamant that the climate changes and the environmental changes are not a result of human agency. I mean, dude, what happened to the goddamn bison? So when you're looking at North America, we are our worst enemy. And until something happens to change that, and I hate to say it, but I think it's going to happen when the environment completely collapses around our ears. And then, of course, we'll blame someone else, just like we always do. So North America is different because the changes that made it into the world power the United States is, and the regional power that Canada is, have ironically almost nothing to do with Mexico to the south, because Mexico has never been a part of that same discussion. Mexico was large, complicated civilizations that have collapsed and new ones started up, and it's consistent. This here is the result of agency by European migrants in the 16, 17, 1800s, which led to the massive changes that make the societies we've got today. Now here in Hawaii, of course, we saw this a little bit later. This didn't hit us until the 19th century, but it's telling that at the same time the United States was growing to the west and basically erasing and changing this entire world. The motivations from North America were largely responsible for the plantation industry, et cetera, which radically changes everything here. So North America is an interesting place because of the opportunities they had to live in one way. Their disinterest in that and the persistence in that disinterest right into 2020. I see absolutely no change in American attitudes collectively from what it was in 1950 or 1860. And I find that to be terrifying because if you're going to be a major political power, a major economic power, one of the world superpowers, you do have along with it a level of more responsibility. You can't act like a little brat. You can't do that and then demand that people pay attention to you. It's either you provide a role model or you just suck wind and just do your own thing. But you can't sit there and want both sides of the equation.